Headlines with Alice.
Radiation levels, which rose after a fire at a damaged nuclear power plant in Japan overnight, have now fallen again. UN weather officials say prevailing winds are blowing the radioactive clouds out to sea, but that the wind direction could change. Rescuers have pulled 2 survivors from rubble in the northeast of the country. And 2 people have been killed in clashes between anti-government protesters and security forces in Bahrain.
Around the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, latest reports from the government say that radiation levels have fallen. They'd spiked to harmful levels after a fire and a third explosion at the site. Weather reports say winds are blowing radiation from the plant on Japan's northeast coast over the Pacific. Officials are warning people within a 20 to 30 kilometre radius of the nuclear plant to either leave the area or stay indoors. The government's also announced a 30 kilometre no-fly zone around the site to prevent planes spreading the radiation further afield. Earlier, I spoke to David Richardson, who is Associate Professor of Epidemiology at the University of North Carolina. He studied the long-term health of nuclear power plant workers and has done work in Japan on the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How did he assess the risks to those who'd been working at the Fukushima plant?
The workers are wearing personal protective equipment and breathing supplied air, so they should be primarily being exposed externally to radiation in the form of gamma radiation, which is like X-rays. It passes through the body. And the reports give some indications of the rates of exposure that they're receiving, which can be anything from a few millisievert per hour to tens or even hundreds of millisieverts. I believe the dose rates are being reported in some parts of the facility. So those are substantial doses.
And how will that physically affect the workers?
As long as they're not spending long periods of time at the really high dose rate, they're not going to have acute effects. But to put the tens of millisieverts per hour into perspective, there'd be very few workers in the United States Department of Energy facilities that would, over the course of their working career, which could be tens of years, who would receive more than 50 millisieverts, let's say, of radiation. So these workers in a few hours are getting fairly high doses, I would say, by contemporary standards for worker protection, and that's likely to pose some risk down the line. There
are long-term risks of cancer for some of these workers, you would say?
Yes. Most kind of radiation protection standards are based on the idea that as you're exposed to more radiation, there's an increasing likelihood that you're going to have more and more chance of causing damage to one of the cells that's going to be a stepping stone towards a future cancer.
Is there any form of treatment that can be handed to them at this stage, or is it already too late for some people? I hate to ask that. What a terribly negative thing to say, but is that the case?
To my knowledge, there's not a good way after exposure of trying to protect somebody from the risks of a subsequent later cancer.
What about people in the wider area? Obviously, there's been an evacuation programme. People have been told to stay inside their houses if they're within the zone and to keep the windows closed. Is that enough protection from the risks, do you think?
The concerns for the environmental contamination relate not just to exposure to gamma rays externally, but probably the more relevant concerns are about inhaling or ingesting, so swallowing particles of radiation or breathing in radioactive gases.
And what could that do?
It's going to be different than having your whole body exposed to a radioactive beam. It's going to be dosed to a specific organ or a piece of tissue, and it's going to depend on what was inhaled or ingested, and that hasn't been really well characterized yet. So they're going to have to take steps in the future to kind of understand how much has been released and where it's released and try and prevent people from being exposed. But it's a very serious situation.
Of course, and people are terribly worried.
Yes, and it's a deficit of information right now. And some of it, we can provide from experience of studying people who have been exposed to radiation. We've studied the bomb survivors. When we start to try and understand environmental exposures, it's much more complicated.
Professor David Richardson. The Japanese economy has faced a triple hit